So from centrum and spirituality to slot machines. The contrast might kill some of you out there, but I'm not. I'm just going to dive right in. My name is Mike Dixon, and are there any Greek people out there? So Yasu Tikana Skala. That's about all I know, other than other important phrases like Mia Bira Parakalo, things like that. Anyway, it's a thrill to be back in Athens. I was here for the first time 30 years ago. So much has changed, but what hasn't changed is the hospitality of the Greek people. It just feels like coming home somehow. I'm just thrilled to be here. What I'll be presenting today is modern multi-line slot machines and some of the dangers that they pose to the public. I'm going to frame the talk in this way. If you just look at the graph I have up here, what it is calls to the Ontario Problem Gambling Helpline. It's basically people, when their gambling is spiraling out of control, they'll call this helpline. And what we see here on the x-axis is the number of calls that come into the center. And on the ordinate here are the different types of the reasons why they're calling. And what you can see is things like sports betting, lottery pose some problems. Card games, particularly with the rise of Texas Hold'em poker, is causing more and more problems. But when we look at slots, year after year, there's something about slot machines that really seems to trigger real problems with gambling, likely the continuous nature of the reinforcement and conditioning. So there's our point of connection. Oops, wrong one. When we think of modern slot machines, Is there a problem with the videos? I'm just going to get the technology sorted out here. Can you ensure that you have the right presentation? It's just Greek 2014. Not the IBM version. Do you want to do it from the laptop? Sorry about this.
While all that's going on, I just passed back some forms as a personal favor. Evaluations of my.
While they're figuring out the sound, I'm just going to go on with my presentation. When we think about the traditional slot machines, we tend to think of these old school type one-arm bandits that I'm showing here. And what we traditionally look for is there are three high-paying symbols, and what we're hoping is when we spin the slot machine, we'll end up getting the symbols to stop under the pay line, and everything is very easy to follow. On the modern slot machines, it's much more complicated. You can see you can play not just on a single line, but on this machine up to 15 different lines. So if you get 3 of the same symbols on any one of those lines, then you'll get some credits. But you have to wager on each of the lines that you play. Here's what it sounds like and looks like. So when you spin and you gain credits, there's all these very cool animations, and there's lots of auditory feedback. You hear that constant rolling sound every time they gain credits. And there's that sound again. This is where the conditioning will come in. Okay, well, you get the idea. So I want to talk just about the allure of these multi-line slot machines and the implications that they have for problem gambling. And I'm going to focus on 3 features of these slot machines. These slot machines, if you look and contrast them with the old school one-arm bandits, I managed to get data from Ontario about slot machine usage, and it turns out the top 100 most heavily used games, the ones that are being played at 2 o'clock in the morning, not by your recreational gambler, but by your problem gambler. Of the 100 top games, 79% of them are these modern slot machines, the multi-line slot machines. And what makes them so popular, I'm going to frame in 3 dimensions. Losses disguised as wins, the sweet sound of losing money, and what I call upping the reinforcement rate. In terms of the losses disguised as wins, what we have here is just the display, and in the bottom left, I'm not sure, you people may be blocked by the table, but you have the running total. So your running balance, you put a bunch of money in, it'll show you how much you've either gained or lost. Here, the person selected to play 15 different lines, and you can bet from 1 to 5 credits on each of these lines. This person has bet 5 credits. So the key thing is that's their total bet per spin is 75 credits. Okay? Credits are like euro cents. They can be dollars. They can be pennies. Let's just, for simplicity, say, and this is realistic, people can bet $75 a spin. Yep. So when you spin and you lose everything, the machine sort of goes quiet. And when you actually win, you get all this positive reinforcing animations and feedback. And you can see the person has won $200. They bet $75 on that spin. So they've actually won money. Okay? On losses disguised as wins, the person has won $25, but they bet $75. They actually lost $50 on that spin. Yet the machine celebrates that outcome with the exact same rolling sounds as on the actual wins. So that's why we call these losses disguised as wins. The disguise is the cool animations and the catchy winning sounds that occur on these losing outcomes. What I think losses disguised as wins do is elicit a failure of categorization. As human beings, we're looking around trying to make complex situations much more simple via the way we categorize things. So when you spin and you lose all of your money, the machine goes into a state of quiet. When you spin and you win money, you win back more than you wagered on that spin. You get all these celebratory sights and sounds. But when you spin and you win back less than your wager on these losses disguised as wins, the machine still plays these celebratory sounds. And I think that causes people to lump these two items together as though they're wins, instead of correctly lumping this type of loss with the full losses. Okay? Now, what data do I have for that? My graduate student Candace published in 2012, Candace Jensen, she looked at 40 novice slot players, just brought them into the lab. They got a little tutorial about the slot machines, much more than you would get at the casino, and then had people actually just play that game that I just showed you. And they use something called the Think Out Loud protocol, and it's just basically asking the person to say out loud whatever they're consciously thinking. Okay, and in addition, and what the purpose of that was to see if they would say, oh, the machine is telling me that I won money, but I actually lost money. They never did that, or the majority of these participants never did that. She also did 50 spins where they were forced to categorize each of the outcomes. And what we showed was they had to say whether it was a win or a loss, and for each spin. And only 7 people out of the 40 novices correctly said that they had lost money on these loss disguised as wins outcomes. Oops. There's an even more, so people seem to be showing this failure to correctly categorize these outcomes as losses. There may be an even more egregious psychological phenomenon that goes with these losses disguised as wins. And it's in the recall of how many times they think they won. So what I've shown here is the fact that we have the programming documents for how these slot machines are programmed. And what we can show is the more lines you play, the greater the percentage of these losses disguised as wins that you will actually encounter. So we tested 47 novice slot players, and we divided them into 2 groups. One group played 200 spins, playing 3 lines. And on average, because this was a real slot machine, some outcomes would differ, but on average, they encountered just 7 of these losses disguised as wins. The other group played 6 lines, and they encountered 19.1 on average of these losses disguised as wins, where they get back far less than they actually wagered on the spin. And at the end of the session, we asked players to estimate the number of times that they won. So the language we used in this part of the session, you had 200 spins. Of these 200 spins, please estimate the number of times on which you actually won. That is, give me a number between 1 and 200. And what I've shown here is in the 3-line group with very few LDWs, these are the actual number of wins. And with few LDWs, people's estimates of how often that they won was actually pretty much spot on. Okay? This is just the confidence interval around the mean. However, in the game with many more LDWs, people are actually misremembering winning more often, significantly more often than they did. This is really dangerous, right? People go to the casino, they feel like they're winning way more often than they are, and they're getting rewarded much more often. They're getting conditioned by these celebratory feedback even when they're losing. So in a real slot machine, there's going to be tremendous variability from session to session because the outcomes are chosen based on a random number generator, but the machine is weighted so that it always makes money over the long haul. But yes. This was, using a real slot machine, but in our lab. So we replicated this study, but with a simulator designed to look like a slot machine and sound like a slot machine, where we could control the outcomes. And what we contrasted was, again, people playing 3 or 6 lines. They were given money to wager, and they weren't using their own money. They were using our money, but they were told at the end they could keep whatever balance that they had. Okay, but we've done it both ways, and we get comparable findings. So the contrast here is 3 versus 6 lines. There are 200 spins. The ending balance in each session is exactly the same. There are 19 wins in either the 3-line game or the 6-line game. The difference was there are far more LDWs in the 6-line game. We ran another group of subjects where we had them play either 3 or 9 lines. And remember, the more lines played, the more LDWs. And here, the actual number of LDWs was huge. It was 46 out of the 200 spins. Okay? This, even though it sounds a lot, these are, depending on the game, the percentage of LDWs that you would find in an actual casino. Okay, what we found was, here are the actual number of wins in white. You can see the 18 here. For the 3-line game with very few LDWs, again, their estimates of how often they won was quite accurate. In the game with 6 lines, where there were way more LDWs, 26 LDWs, they again overestimated the number of times that they won. This graph just shows the 3-line group, a different set of subjects. Again, they're quite accurate in estimating how many times they won when there are very few LDWs. But if you have a lot of LDWs, what you get is an exacerbation of this overestimation effect. So we can, by varying the number of LDWs that you have, the number of these losses disguised as wins, you can push around how often the person thought that they won, even though the amount that they won remained constant in all conditions. So at this point, all we know is for novices, losses disguised as wins make people think that they won more often than they actually did. Here's one of the old school one-armed bandits. And that was a win. And I just wanted to show you the kind of rudimentary celebratory sounds of the old school ones when you compare them to these modern slot machines. Here, when you spin and you actually win something, it's far more exciting. In terms of the sound dimensions, the music is much more complex. It's designed to get your heart rate ramped up. So we wondered, what's the role of sounds in the disguise of losses disguised as wins? So what we did was to investigate this. We now tested people at the casino, but instead of using just novice slot players, there were 26 people that didn't play that often, once a month or less. 20 high-frequency non-problem gamblers who played at least twice a month, and 31 moderate-risk gamblers and 19 problem gamblers assessed by the Problem Gambling Severity Index, the gold standard for assessing gambling problems. They played 200 spins with the sounds on and 200 spins with the sounds off. Again, they were given money to wager with and told that they could keep whatever they want at the end. Okay, and the sound on and sound off conditions were, of course, counterbalanced. Here's what our simulator looked like. So just like the real slot machines, when the reels are spinning, you get an outcome. It's a 9-line simulator, and the person won 0, so the machine goes into a state of quiet. Here's an LDW. They get the reinforcing feedback, but if you look, they won 6 credits, they bet 9 credits, they lost like $3 or whatever. Here's an actual win. Okay, and again you see the similarity in the sounds between the actual wins and the losses disguised as wins. In the sound off condition, it was exactly the same during the reel spinning, but when the key difference is on a loss disguised as wins, we kept the visual animation, but we turned the sound off. Okay? So no auditory celebratory feedback. And the same for the actual wins. I don't know if you can see it, but it's counting up the win here. They won 40 credits, bet 9 credits. What we did was we assessed which game they preferred, the one with the sound on or the sound off. We administered something called the Game Experiences Questionnaire, just about how arousing they found the game, questions like that. But crucially, we asked them to estimate the number of times that they won more than they wagered. And again, we use very specific language, give a number between 1 and 200. Okay, in terms of the game preference, 72% preferred it with the sounds on. 44 out of 66 explicitly mentioned, I like the winning sounds. This was interesting. 5 said that they felt they won more often with the sound on, even though the wins were actually equated. And they rated the game with the sound on as being more arousing, which is important because arousal is kind of the reinforcer in problem gambling. Here's the crucial stuff. In each condition there are 28 wins, but there are also 28 losses disguised as wins. And our prediction were, if sound is an integral part of the disguise and losses disguised as wins, then they're actually going to overestimate more in that sound on condition than in the sound off condition. Well, what did we find? In this sample, people tended to really overestimate the number of wins, even with the sound off. But crucially, that effect was exacerbated with the sounds on. It was significant. So what it's saying is sounds are an important point, an important component of the disguise in losses disguised as wins. And they cause people to think that they won more often than they did. Okay, the other important point here is you might think, well, maybe it's just the novice players that are doing the overestimations. You can see that the high frequency, the moderate, and the problem gamblers are the ones carrying the bulk of the overestimations. Okay? So it's these guys are, problem gamblers are playing, some are playing every day, and they're still getting taken in by the disguise of these losses disguised as wins. We ran a correlation just between the problem gambling severity index as a continuous score. So we just correlated their score on that with their actual win estimates and showed that it was significant with the sound off, even more significant with the sound on. And importantly, in a different sample, we actually replicated that relation. The take-home message is both novices and more seasoned gamblers are prone to this LDW win overestimation effect. and that sounds are an integral part of the disguise in losses disguised as wins. Okay, the final component of my talk will be what I call upping the reinforcement rate. And parts of this component really get into the wheelhouse of problem gambling. It's interesting the way slot machines are programmed. And again, we use the Freedom of Information Act because slot machines are regulated by the government in Ontario. Through the Freedom of Information, we applied and got the programming documents, so now we know exactly how they're programmed. It's fascinating and counterintuitive, but the number of lines played does not influence the payback that you get in terms of the percentage-wise. Just to show you, we did a simulation, thankfully, because it's simulation, this didn't cost us any money. We did 5,000 spins at $1 per line, and in the one line case, so they wagered $5,000. The credits that they won after the end of the session was 4,525, which translates to a payback percentage of 90.5%. What that means is the casino keeps 9.5 or around 10% of every dollar wagered. Doesn't sound like much, but a single slot machine will generate $120,000 Canadian a year. So when you can imagine all the people that went on the tour to Lutraki are now at the casino being victimized by these losses disguised as wins. But the point is, over the lifetime, you can win on a given session, but over the lifetime of the machine, you always will lose. 20 lines, because they're wagering $1 per line, they wagered 100,000 credits. The amount that they won was 90,504. Again, the percentage doesn't change. What's important, though, for problem gambling is the experience of the play really, really changes. So in the single line case, those what I call straight losses or regular losses, they spin, they lose their entire wager, the machine goes in a state of quiet. In a one line game, that's 4,229 out of 5,000 spins. In a multi-line game, there are far fewer of those outcomes. The wins are about the same. There are no losses disguised as wins in those single line games. But look at how many there are in the 20 line condition. Okay? We describe this in terms of the celebratory event frequency. How often Homer there gets exposed to the exciting sights and sounds. Okay? So in the playing one line, Homer would hear the exciting sights and sounds on 15% of the spins. If he plays 20 lines, it's almost on half the spins. Another way to think about it is he'll hear the reinforcement on every 6.5 spins playing one line, but almost every other spin playing the multi-line game. So this is what leads me to say playing multiple lines ups the reinforcement rate. And what we had predicted is that players will prefer being reinforced more often, even though most of that reinforcement is when they're losing money. And we predicted that the experience will be very different for these people. Here's where it gets really interesting. Some researchers like Jacobs and Patricia Dow-Schull have talked about dissociation while playing slots. People become completely absorbed and forget everything around them, lose track of time, which is deadly because then they keep playing and they're losing more and more money. Dow-Schull, in her book Addiction by Design, calls it entering the zone. Problem gamblers talk about often problem gamblers gamble to escape depression, and they'll talk about when I'm playing, that's the only time I forget all about my depression, all of the problems in my life. Often they're caused by gambling, so it's a vicious circle. But she suggests that games that promote entry into the zone are these ones with a high celebratory event frequency. Those ones like the multi-line games. So what we did is we assessed absorption and dissociation using 2 questions that were part of the gambling experiences question or game experience questionnaire. And the 2 questions were, I forgot everything around me, I felt completely absorbed. And they were given these not at all, slightly, moderately, fairly, or extremely response options that then you can code in terms of a 1 to 5 score. So in a previous study, not the one I'm about to show you, what we showed was that the problem gamblers preferentially endorse those absorption items. Okay, they're the ones that are getting into the zone. So in the current study, what we did was we tested 102 gamblers. Again, we used a modified cutoffs of this problem gambling severity index, the new state-of-the-art cutoffs. And we had 30 non-problem, 48 low risk, but also 28 high risk gamblers. Okay, players played 250 spins on 1 line and 250 spins playing 20 lines, and it was the same game. Okay, they just selected either 1 line or 20 lines. They got money to play, they got to keep whatever they won. They ended up losing because it was programmed that way. Losing at the standard payback percentage of machines in the casino. We asked after each game, after they finished the entire experiment, we asked which game they preferred. We also asked questions about how arousing they felt each game was, how absorbing the games were, using those questions I showed you, how pleasant, and just as a kind of check, we asked about any negative affect. Crucially then, we asked about their win estimates at the end of playing the 1 line and the 20 line game. And our predictions were that because of this celebratory event frequency, the upping of the reinforcement rate, we predicted that players would find the 20 line game more pleasant, more arousing and exciting, and players, especially the problem gamblers, would find the 20 line game more absorbing than the 1 line game. And players would overestimate their wins, but only in the 20 line game, right? Because there are no LDWs in the single line game. Okay, what do we find? Well, we found 11 minutes and 10 seconds out of 98 players. That's 91 out of 98 players preferred the 20 line game over the 1 line game. People just find the 1 line game, it's strings of loss, 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 and occasional wins. People find it really boring. So if we look at their pleasantness ratings, we have in yellow is the 1 line game, and in purple is the 20 line game. People found the 20 line game significantly more pleasant. They found it significantly more arousing and exciting. And again, we asked them if there was negative affect. We found that the 1 line game, because they were really bored, generated more negative affect significantly than the 20 line game. Okay, recall our prediction concerning how absorbed players would be. And remember, in that other study, the problem gamblers indicated that they entered the zone, they forgot everything around them, and they felt completely absorbed. We predicted that we would replicate that finding with the problem gamblers endorsing those items more strongly, but only for the 20 line game, only for the one where they're getting reinforced all the time. Okay, so this is just the nothing much is going on with the non-problem gamblers and the low risk gamblers, but our high risk gamblers, this flow is basically those questions on absorption, and I forgot everything around me. They were not endorsing very much absorption for the one-line game, but they had endorsed significantly more absorption for the 20-line game. So there's something about these 20-line games, and we think it's this constant reinforcement that promotes entry into that zone, that dissociation that can be a type of negative reinforcement, actually. So high-risk gamblers are particularly absorbed by the 20-line game. For the win estimates, again, we predicted, because if they're driven by the LDWs, and there are no LDWs in the single line game, then their estimates should be relatively spot on. In the 20-line game, where there are lots of LDWs, that's where we should get the overestimation effect. And what we showed was just that. Okay? Not significantly different from the true amount of wins in the blue line, whereas significantly greater overestimates in the 20-line game. So in summary, losses disguised as wins tend to cause players to overestimate the number of times that they won. They feel like they've won way more often than they actually did in reality. And we think this poses a problem in that when you recollect on a day's session at the slot machine, you feel like you're winning all the time, you're more likely to return. We've shown that players really prefer the games with the auditory feedback, and that that auditory feedback actually contributes to the feeling that you won more often than you have in actuality. And finally, in terms of upping the reinforcement rate, the more lines you play, the more often you'll hear those reinforcing bells and whistles, even though most of the time when you hear those bells and whistles, you've actually lost money. Players prefer those type of games, and the problem gamblers become preferentially more absorbed in the 20-line games. And finally, everybody thinks that they won more often playing multi-lines versus single-line games. Okay.